Hey guys, it's me. It's we're dealing with Lionel G. Scale Thomas with some good old footage here. It's a frick.
Hello everybody, it's me, GORP, and I'm here to talk about my G-Scale Strasburg Thomas. I'm going to be talking about how I built it, why I built it, and how you can also make one. It's honestly not the hardest process, so this won't be the worst idea I've ever done, unlike some other videos. I'm looking at half my shorts. Anywho, that's beside the point. So, without further ado, let's get into why I made this thing. Alright, now something you might notice is that, well, it's a little odd that I'm specifically talking about this thing, my first ever custom, instead of Thomas or James. Now, there's nothing wrong with them, and it's not that I don't like them either. I love those guys, or I wouldn't own them or painted them up. Only thing is, well, how do I put this? Right. Look, people have been talking about these things plenty of times, and I would like to not have to add to that laborious fire. So, I figured I'd talk about something that's a one of its kind. And besides, as far as I can tell, this is the only one of its kind. There are plenty of other models of Strasburg Thomas, but not in G-scale. And the only one I did find, as far as I could tell, still unfinished, and he used the wrong chassis. Look, bud, you did the right thing with the shell, but you should have just went with the normal chassis. Trust me, I just proved that it would work. Now again, I guess I should ask the question that I already started with, is why did I make this thing? Well, it was kind of the only other thing I could make that was legitimately easy and wasn't going to be tedious to make. And something else, a big inspiration for this thing, Ben 10 Life, who took inspiration from him, considering the fact that, well, aside from him restoring his versions of Thomas and James, he also made about 4 or 5 customs, and is currently working on finishing up his Toby and Henrietta. And some of the engines he made consist of Edward and Origins Thomas and James, as well as a RCified Thomas that is essentially Thomas in the special letter. So, he was a pretty big inspiration in making this model. And aside from that, yeah, I also just simply like how a lot of people have been making really well-made models. And my model is far from accurate. There are still plenty of things that are off, despite the face still being quite uncanny, just like the real thing's alternative face that it used to have back in 2000. Of course, there are plenty of other oddities, like the missing lamp irons, the lack of boiler tubing going along the engine's side, and of course, the valve gear. Look, listen, you gotta understand what I was working with. You know, I can only do that. Now, people have been telling me countless times, and you know what, they're right, so I should 3D print the valve gear and cow catcher, and at some point I do plan to do that, since that seems to be the smartest choice. But I'll get into the whole building process later when we get into that, which, speaking of which, we're actually getting into that right now. Okay, so before we get into the segment, I am actually going to show the first test run of this thing. It was very basic, and all I did was simply put the Thomas shell over this thing's chassis after we cut the wires, which I'll get into that in a minute. Yeah, as you can see, he's very primitive in his state. Okay, so what exactly do you need in order to make this thing? Well, basically, all you need is a Lionel G-Scale Thomas, and literally any version of this thing will work except the ready-to-play version, which, do I really need to explain why that's not gonna work? Like, I'm not an idiot, I know what I'm doing, and you should too. Anywho, any original from 1993 to 1995, or the reissue from 2003, I believe, or 2013, any of those will do. So, you got your Thomas, right? Well, you're not ready just yet. Something else you'll need is Lionel's old 060. This thing is very crucial in making this model, because without it, well, all you have is just a normal Thomas, which there's no problem with that, but just like the original model, it looks off, which is kind of the main reason I used this Thomas to make it, because it looks off. So, yeah, we're gonna need that 060. Alright, so you got your 060 and Thomas. Good. Now, the next part is to cut up both of them. So, the process I use, which as you can see right now, I had my dad, which, by the way, also another major help. I love you, Dad. Anywho, so, aside from, as you can see, him cutting into Thomas's running board in order to compensate for the cylinders, and we also had to cut on the beam that's holding up the valve gear, so you will have to cut off those nubs. Now, I know what you're also seeing. You're also seeing those kind of gear-looking things sticking out of the top of the chassis. You will have to take those off. But don't worry, you don't gotta cut them. Since they're quite literally being held in by square pegs, all you gotta do is just lift them up. Same thing goes with the cylinders. Those brass-looking things on the top of them, you can simply rip them off without breaking them, and that'll be all fine and dandy. So, yeah, that's at least the aesthetic parts all done. Now, aside from having to cut into the running board, as I've already said and shown at least 20 times now, you will also have to cut into the sides of the chassis in order to compensate. Now, something else I also should note is that if you have a working smoke unit, you will have to solder. Of course, as you could tell in the footage from before and what you might be seeing now, my Thomas doesn't have the smoke unit. But if your 060 has a smoke unit and it still works, I'd recommend using it. More than likely what you'll have to do is that you'll have to somehow pry the smoke unit out of the funnel and then drill a hole through Thomas's funnel. Then, simply do what they did with the 060 and stick it up Thomas's funnel, and there you go, Thomas has a smoke unit. Also, you might be wondering where all this room is coming from for Thomas to have the smoke unit. It's because he's not going to have an iMech. So, just bear that in mind that if you're, which, to be fair, he shouldn't have one to begin with. He'd be more accurate to the real Strasburg Thomas in not having the ability to move his eyes, since I'm pretty sure that Thomas can only look one direction, since that's all he was built to do. Anyway, that's beside the point. So, you have cut down your chassis, removed all the aesthetic parts, and now you put Thomas's chassis over it. We got the first rough prototype of Thomas looking. What the frick? He is, Shed 17 in over here. But whatever. Anywho, whenever we actually got him put all together, I gave him his first test run, and this is pretty much how it went. Yeah, I got a few photos of him looking like he did, and we did have to cut some plastic in order to compensate for the cylinders, which, by the way, probably should have said this earlier, but you will have to cut that red block. Hey, if you didn't already know, now you know. At this point, Thomas looked like Strasburg. Kinda. I mean, he had the cylinders and the valve gear, but that was about it. Anyway, that's beside the point. So, now you've got them all together, right? Well, next part is giving him a cow catcher. So, what you'll need, at least for this basic one, is cardboard. And you'll simply have to cut it in order to compensate for all of this. Then, like I did here, I painted it gray in order to, go with Thomas and to stand out. Look, listen, I know the real Strasburg Thomas is a black cow catcher, but you can barely see it due to that. The only reason we know is because the video is directly showing us it. Anywho, so, now, if you're wanting your cow catcher to pop, what I would do is copy the Railway Showdown's version of Strasburg Thomas. As you can see, there are some very massive holes here. So I would do what that thing did and have the massive holes in order to make it pop more. So, there you go. You now have a cow catcher that's gray and with the black lines in order to make it pop out. So there you go. Now Thomas is a cow catcher. Next thing I did was Thomas's lining on his boiler. Now see, if you're like me and an amateur, not a good painter and whatnot, you'll use paint Sharpies. Which is also what Ben 10 of Life did, and this was my main inspiration for this. But it's also recommended that if you know how to paint, do your techniques that help you work with this. Don't do what I did, because I'm an idiot, alright? I'm a 14-year-old kid who doesn't really know what he's doing. I don't even know how I made it look okay at best. Anyway, so, you've done the lining on the boiler. Great job! Now, the next thing that I did was the running board. Simply paint it white. Not much else I can tell you there, bud. Just paint it white. It is really that simple. Now, the next and final and also most important step. Painting those gosh-forsaken cylinders. See, like before, the cylinder caps can come off, and it is quintessential that you remove them to make it as easy as possible. You can paint up the cylinders while you're doing this as well. Paint up the cylinders and paint up the cylinder caps. This will be crucial. Now, put it all together. And it should look a little something like this. Good, okay. Now, at this point, I had actually got the first little bit of test footage with this, which this video is actually up on the channel, but it will probably be deleted and just simply put into here. So, anywho, at this point, Strasburg was done. All was left to do was to simply give him a good old run.
He's a really useful engine, you know. All the other engines that have you slow. He huffs and puffs and whistles, rushing to and fro. He's the really useful engine we adore. He's a really useful engine, you know. 'Cause the fan controller, he told him so. Now that's right, to call his very own. He's the really useful engine we adore. He's the one. He's the one. He's the really useful engine that we adore. He's the one. He's the number one. Thomas the Tank Engine. He's a really useful engine, you know. Maybe little, but he's never slow. Stand back in amazement, just you watch him go. He's the really useful engine we adore. He's the one. He's the one. He's the really useful engine that we adore. He's the one. He's the number one. Thomas the Tank Engine. He's the really useful engine we adore.
Oh, you stayed till the end. I truly was not expecting this. Most people tend to click off by this point, but I'm proud. Very thankful that you have stayed. You know what? You stayed long enough. You stayed through a 13-minute video. This is by far my longest. You deserve a reward. Thomas, cue the music. Cue the music. I said cue the Thomas.
Oh,
Thomas,
what's going on?
wake up. Cue the music.
Okay, there. My bad, my fault. Band, do your thing.
Thank you.
Can we do that? Is that the cylinder loves to come out.
What do we need to address?
Well, I mean, I don't want to glue them together because there's maintenance on it. Ah! What's wrong with